Have you ever felt that strange silence from someone who once meant everything to you? The kind of silence that doesn't feel like the end, but also doesn't feel like peace? It's confusing, almost haunting. One moment they were close, emotionally present, sharing moments with you, and the next moment they pulled away as if a quiet wall appeared between you. No dramatic goodbye, no clear explanation, just distance. And the more you try to understand it, the more it feels like trying to read a message written in invisible ink. But here's the part most people miss. That silence does not always mean they stopped caring. In fact, sometimes the silence is happening because they care more than they know how to handle. People with avoidant tendencies have a way of dealing with emotions that looks cold from the outside, but inside it is far more complicated. When things start to feel emotionally intense, when closeness begins to demand vulnerability, their instinct is not to lean in, it is to step back. And that step back can feel like rejection to the person on the other side. But what if that distance is actually part of their internal struggle? What if the person who seems so detached is quietly hoping that somehow, some way, things can reconnect again, but only if something happens first? Because the truth is, when an avoidant pulls away, the story is rarely as simple as people think. Most people believe that if someone wanted them back, they would just reach out, say the words, and fix things. But for an avoidant, emotions don't work that way. Their mind is wired to protect them from emotional overwhelm, even if that protection costs them the very connection they secretly miss. And this is where things become incredibly confusing for the person who still cares, because the avoidant might want you back, but at the same time, they're waiting for something from you, something that signals safety, something that tells them that reconnecting won't trap them in emotional chaos again. And until they see that signal, they often remain quiet, watching from a distance, hoping the situation somehow changes, without them having to risk being vulnerable first. To understand this behavior, you have to step into the emotional world of someone who lives behind avoidance. From the outside, they often look calm, independent, even emotionally distant. They might appear like someone who doesn't need anyone, someone who moves on easily. But that surface image hides something deeper. Avoidant people don't lack emotions. In fact, they often feel emotions very intensely. The difference is that their mind learned a long time ago that emotional closeness can be dangerous. Somewhere in their past, vulnerability may have been met with disappointment, pressure, or emotional chaos. So their brain built a defense system, a quiet rule that says, when things get too close, create space. When emotions start rising, shut them down. When connection feels overwhelming, step away before it consumes you. This coping pattern becomes automatic over time. They don't even realize they're doing it. It's like a reflex, and that reflex can make relationships incredibly complicated. Because while they might truly care about someone, their instinct is still to protect themselves from emotional intensity. So when things become deep or serious, their mind starts sending warning signals. Suddenly they feel like they're losing control. Like the relationship might start demanding things they're not ready to give. That's when the distance begins. But here's the part that most people misunderstand. Just because an avoidant pulls away doesn't mean their feelings disappear. Many times those feelings stay with them quietly, even after the distance grows. They might still think about the connection. They might still replay memories in their mind. They might even wonder what would happen if things somehow worked differently the next time. But instead of reaching out and expressing those thoughts, they stay silent, not because they don't care, but because their emotional wiring tells them that silence is safer than risking vulnerability again. One of the biggest reasons avoidants rarely make the first move after distance appears is fear, but not the kind of fear people usually imagine. It's not always fear of rejection in the traditional sense. It's fear of emotional exposure. Reaching out first requires admitting that the connection still matters. It requires opening a door that they worked very hard to close. And for someone who uses emotional distance as protection, opening that door feels incredibly risky. Imagine standing at the edge of something that once overwhelmed you emotionally. Your mind remembers the intensity, the expectations, the vulnerability. Even if part of you misses the connection, another part of you is whispering warnings. What if things go back to being emotionally heavy? What if the same pressure returns? What if you lose your sense of independence again? These questions create hesitation. So instead of acting on their feelings, avoidants often choose the safer path, waiting. Waiting allows them to keep their emotional armor intact. If you reach out first, the risk feels smaller for them. If you initiate contact calmly, it signals that the situation might be different this time, that maybe the emotional environment is safer than it was before. In their mind, This makes reconnecting less dangerous. This is why many avoidants stay quiet, even when part of them still cares. They are not necessarily hoping the connection disappears. They are hoping the situation changes in a way that makes vulnerability feel less threatening, and until they see that change, they remain still, almost frozen between their desire for connection and their instinct for self-protection. Inside an avoidant person, there is often a quiet conflict happening that nobody else can see. One side of them remembers the connection, the comfort, the shared moments that once felt meaningful. That side wonders if things could work again. It feels curiosity, maybe even longing. But the other side of them is focused entirely on safety. That side remembers the emotional intensity, the moments where vulnerability felt overwhelming, the times when expectations felt heavy. And that side says stepping back was the right decision. So these two voices live side by side in their mind, one pulling them toward connection, the other pushing them toward distance. This internal tug-of-war can last for weeks or even months, and during that time, they may appear completely unaffected on the outside. They go about their life, focusing on work, hobbies, routines, but internally there are moments where the connection resurfaces in their thoughts. A memory appears unexpectedly. A song reminds them of something shared. A quiet moment brings back the feeling of what once existed. And that's when the conflict becomes strongest, because they might feel the urge to reach out, but the protective side of them quickly steps in, reminding them why distance felt necessary in the first place. So they do nothing. They wait. They observe. They let time pass, hoping clarity will somehow arrive without them having to face vulnerability head-on. And this is where the hidden expectation begins to form. When an avoidant wants to reconnect, but fears vulnerability, they start watching for something from the other person. Not dramatic gestures, not emotional speeches. What they are quietly looking for is reassurance. Reassurance that reconnecting will not pull them back into emotional chaos. Reassurance that the relationship dynamic could be calmer, healthier, and less overwhelming than before. They want to see emotional stability. They want to see independence. They want to feel that if they step closer again, they won't suddenly be trapped in intense expectations or constant emotional demands. And this is the part that surprises most people, because many assume the way to win an avoidant back is through chasing, convincing, or proving love with intensity. But for an avoidant mind, intensity is exactly what creates fear. What actually makes them feel safer is the opposite: calmness, patience, space. When they see someone living their life confidently, not begging for attention, not forcing conversations, not creating pressure, it changes the emotional atmosphere in their mind. Suddenly, the connection feels less threatening. Suddenly, the possibility of talking again doesn't feel like stepping into a storm. It feels more like stepping into calm water. And that subtle shift is often the first moment when an avoidant starts reconsidering the distance they created. They may not show it immediately. They may still stay quiet for a while. But internally, something begins to change. Because the signal they were waiting for, the sign that reconnecting could be safe, might finally be starting to appear. And yet, this is where the story takes a turn that confuses almost everyone who has ever dealt with an avoidant. The natural reaction when someone pulls away is to chase them, to send the long message, to ask the questions that have been sitting heavily in your chest, to demand clarity, closure, reassurance, anything that can make the silence stop hurting. It's human. When someone we care about creates distance, our instincts push us to close that gap as fast as possible. But for someone with avoidant tendencies, that reaction often triggers the exact opposite result. The more pressure they feel, the more their mind interprets the situation as emotional danger. It doesn't matter if the message is loving or heartfelt. What their brain hears is intensity, urgency, expectation, and that intensity immediately activates the same protective mechanism that made them pull away in the first place. So instead of feeling comforted, they feel overwhelmed. Instead of leaning closer, they create even more distance. This is the painful paradox that so many people experience. The more someone tries to prove their love, the further the avoidant seems to drift away. And from the outside, it feels deeply unfair, because you're trying to save the connection, while they seem to be abandoning it. But inside their mind, something very different is happening. They're not running because they don't care. They're running because the emotional temperature suddenly feels too high again. And when that happens, distance becomes their way of cooling everything down. While this distance is happening, something else is quietly unfolding behind the scenes. Even when avoidants appear detached, they often continue observing from afar, not in an obvious way, not with constant communication, but in subtle, almost invisible ways. They might glance at your social media stories. They might notice changes in your life. They might hear updates through mutual connections. These small glimpses allow them to monitor the emotional landscape without fully stepping back into it. Think of it like someone standing just outside a room, listening before deciding whether it's safe to walk in again. What they're really watching for is not whether you still care. Most of the time, they already know you care. What they are watching for is emotional stability. They want to see signs that the energy around the relationship has shifted, that the pressure they once felt is no longer waiting for them if they return. When they notice someone living their life, focusing on personal growth, friendships, passions, and calm independence, something begins to change inside them. The connection stops looking like a trap. It starts looking like a possibility again. And this observation phase can last longer than people expect. Avoidants rarely rush emotional decisions. They take their time studying the situation quietly, making sure the environment feels safe enough before even considering a step forward. During this time, avoidants often place people through something that feels like a silent test. It isn't a test they consciously design, but it happens naturally through their behavior. They watch how someone reacts to distance. They watch how someone handles uncertainty. If the other person responds with anger, emotional outbursts, accusations, or desperate attempts to force contact, the avoidant mind quickly interprets that as confirmation of their deepest fear. It tells them that reconnecting would only bring back emotional chaos. But if the reaction is different, if the other person remains calm, respectful of boundaries, and focused on their own life rather than chasing relentlessly, the avoidant begins to notice something surprising. Their usual expectation of pressure never appears. Instead of feeling cornered, they start feeling curious. That curiosity is incredibly important, because curiosity is one of the few emotions that can slowly soften an avoidant's defenses. When someone reacts with emotional maturity instead of panic, it disrupts the pattern they were expecting. And when patterns break, people start reconsidering their assumptions. The avoidant may begin wondering if they misunderstood the situation before. They may start asking themselves if reconnecting could actually feel different this time, but they won't reveal those thoughts yet. From the outside, they may still look distant and unaffected. Inside, though, the emotional walls that once felt solid may begin developing small cracks. This is why the signs that an avoidant still wants you are rarely loud or dramatic. They show up quietly, almost like whispers rather than declarations. Maybe they suddenly watch your stories again after weeks of silence. Maybe they like a post that seems random but meaningful. Sometimes they send a short message that appears casual on the surface, but feels oddly timed, as if they were thinking about you before pressing send. These small gestures can feel confusing because they don't match the emotional depth that once existed between you. They might message about something simple, a joke, a memory, or a neutral topic that has nothing to do with the relationship itself. And you might find yourself wondering why they would reach out at all if they weren't interested in reconnecting. The answer often lies in their fear of emotional exposure. These subtle interactions allow them to test the waters without diving in completely. It's their way of checking whether communication still feels safe, whether the atmosphere between you has changed, whether talking again will lead to calm conversation or emotional confrontation. Each small interaction gives them information about whether stepping closer would feel manageable or overwhelming. But even when those quiet signs appear, avoidants often continue waiting instead of fully returning. And that waiting can feel incredibly frustrating for the person on the other side, because it raises the same question over and over again. If they care, why don't they just come back? Why not simply say what they feel and rebuild the connection openly? The truth is that waiting gives them control over their emotional exposure. As long as they remain cautious, they can protect themselves from diving back into vulnerability too quickly. They want to see consistency before they risk lowering their guard. They want to observe whether the calm energy they're noticing is temporary or real. In their mind, time becomes a measuring tool. The longer they see stability, patience, and independence, the more their fears begin to lose their grip. Slowly, the possibility of reconnecting begins to feel less like a threat and more like a choice they might actually feel comfortable making. And when that shift happens, something subtle but powerful occurs inside them. The person they once created distance from no longer looks like a source of pressure. Instead, they begin to look like someone who might finally understand the delicate balance that an avoidant heart needs in order to feel safe enough to come closer again. And this is where most people completely misread the situation. They assume that in order to get an avoidant back, they need to chase harder, prove their love more, or pressure them into action. But the avoidant mind works differently. For them, intensity triggers fear, not attraction. The more someone demands closeness or asks for answers, the more they retreat into their walls. What they actually want is a very subtle signal, a demonstration that reconnecting will not recreate the old chaos. They are watching not for words of love, but for evidence of calmness, independence, and emotional maturity. They want to know that you have boundaries, that you are stable, that you will not overwhelm them if they take the cautious step back into connection. And the most ironic part is that while their silence may feel frustrating, that very silence is also a way they're processing the possibility of returning. They are quietly measuring the emotional climate, testing it against the patterns they once experienced, and waiting to see if things have shifted enough to feel safe again. From the outside, this patience, or what looks like indifference, can be hard to understand. But inside, it's a calculated, protective approach designed to prevent them from repeating past emotional overwhelm. When you finally begin to notice small gestures, like a casual message or a like on a post, it's easy to dismiss them as meaningless. But for an avoidant, these gestures are massive. Every small sign of connection is like dipping a toe into the water before jumping in. They are testing themselves as much as they are testing you. Each minor interaction allows them to see if emotions can flow without triggering panic. Each observation reassures them that the space around the relationship is calmer than it used to be. And as these small interactions accumulate, the avoidance perspective begins to shift. What once seemed overwhelming now starts to feel manageable. They begin to imagine that reconnecting might not lead to emotional chaos, that closeness could exist alongside personal freedom, and that the connection they once valued could feel safe again. And here is the crucial part. They are still extremely cautious. They are not ready for vulnerability yet, but they are beginning to allow themselves to consider it. That tiny crack in their armor is the moment when hope quietly begins to enter, and it's the moment that most people completely miss if they are expecting overt gestures or dramatic declarations. This is why understanding the avoidance internal process is so important. They are not cold or heartless. They are not indifferent to love or connection. They are wired to protect themselves, often as a result of experiences where vulnerability led to pain. So when they step back, it is not because they don't care. It is because they fear losing control of their emotions, or being trapped in a dynamic that feels unsafe. And yet, when they notice that the other person can handle space, patience, and emotional stability, something remarkable happens. Their mind begins to rewrite the script. The story that once warned them to pull away now whispers that it might be okay to come closer, that the connection could exist without suffocating them, that love can feel safe rather than threatening. But this process cannot be rushed. Any attempt to force it will usually push them back into the protective patterns they've relied on for years. They need to feel, in subtle ways, that you understand the balance they require. And when that balance is finally noticed, the walls they built do not crumble immediately. They slowly soften. The change is quiet at first, almost imperceptible, but it is profoundly significant for anyone who understands the nature of avoidant behavior. At this stage, the avoidant is often still silent externally, but internally the gears are turning. They replay past interactions, weighing what worked and what didn't. They notice patterns in your behavior, how you respond to space and pressure. They watch for consistency, for the subtle demonstration that you can remain emotionally present without being overwhelming. And every time they observe calmness instead of desperation, patience instead of chasing, they begin to feel a cautious curiosity. This curiosity is their way of imagining a future where the relationship can exist without the intense push-pull dynamic they once feared. They start to consider the possibility that emotional closeness doesn't have to feel like danger. And as they start to imagine this, their mind begins running scenarios. What if I reach out and it works differently this time? What if it feels safe to be close? But these scenarios are still tentative. They will continue to move slowly, testing the waters in small, cautious ways before they are ready to step forward fully. This period of internal consideration is critical because it lays the groundwork for genuine reconnection when they finally decide the emotional environment is safe enough. And now comes the delicate balance that most people overlook entirely. For an avoidant, the single most powerful thing you can do is demonstrate independence while maintaining calm availability. They are not asking for grand gestures or proclamations of love. They are asking for a quiet signal that you are emotionally stable, grounded in yourself, and not going to create pressure. This is what they are hoping for before they allow themselves to reconnect. Your life, your routines, your confidence, all of these act as proof that the relationship can now exist without overwhelming them. They start to notice that your reactions are measured, that your emotions are not dictated by fear or anxiety, and that your presence is steady rather than desperate. And this observation gradually shifts the emotional environment in their mind. The connection that once triggered panic now starts to feel like a safe possibility. They begin considering that returning doesn't have to repeat the past, and while their outward behavior may still appear cautious, this is the moment when the avoidant's internal walls begin to relax, ever so slightly. They are not fully back yet, but the foundation for true reconnection is quietly being laid. Each subtle signal you provide of stability and patience acts like a gentle key turning in a lock, allowing them to inch closer toward the emotional space they once feared to enter. And this is where it gets truly fascinating, because avoidants often begin testing the connection in very small, almost imperceptible ways. They may reach out casually, sending a message that seems innocent or trivial. It could be a joke, a memory, or a neutral question. Nothing emotional, nothing heavy. And yet for them, this small act carries enormous significance. It is their way of experimenting with closeness without fully exposing themselves to vulnerability. They are watching for your reaction, studying your energy, and gauging whether reconnecting will feel safe. Every calm, measured response you provide reinforces the idea that the connection no longer carries the chaos it once did. And every overreaction, every desperate plea, every attempt to force closeness only strengthens the fear that pulled them away in the first place. The avoidant is not rejecting love, they are rejecting the possibility of repeating a painful pattern. And in these tentative interactions, they are feeling the emotional temperature of the relationship in a way that allows them to slowly imagine being present again. It is a delicate dance, a test that feels invisible but carries enormous weight. And if the other person is wise enough to respond with patience, consistency, and calmness, this tiny test can be the first step toward real emotional reconnection. At the same time, avoidants often wrestle with fear of commitment in a very specific way. They fear losing themselves in a relationship more than losing the relationship itself. They fear being swallowed by expectations, responsibilities, or emotional intensity that feels too heavy. This is why they often want the other person to demonstrate stability and self-reliance first. They are secretly hoping to see proof that the relationship can exist without compromising their sense of autonomy. They want to know that you can manage your emotions without leaning too heavily on them, that you can maintain your independence and still care deeply. And when they start to perceive these qualities in you, their internal dialogue begins to change. They begin to imagine what a healthier dynamic could look like. They start to believe that closeness does not have to equal pressure. They start to feel that love does not have to feel like danger. And that subtle shift, the recognition that you are capable of calm, measured presence, often becomes the turning point that leads them to cautiously re-engage. And even when they begin re-engaging, avoidants rarely leap in all at once. They tend to approach in phases, like someone testing the water in a swimming pool. Before diving in, they may initiate small conversations, offer casual compliments, or engage in playful banter. These are their ways of assessing whether the environment has truly changed, whether the relationship can now be navigated safely. And each interaction is a careful negotiation between desire and fear. They want connection, but they are terrified of losing the control they fought so hard to regain. They are constantly scanning for emotional signals, looking for stability, patience, and calmness. And when they sense that these signals are present, they allow themselves to take another step forward. It is slow, cautious, deliberate. And it is in this slow, deliberate pace that the most profound transformation occurs. The avoidant begins to imagine that love can exist without suffocating them, that closeness can coexist with autonomy, that vulnerability can feel safe rather than threatening. And if you continue to meet them with patience and steady emotional presence, they may gradually lower the walls that once felt impenetrable. The conversations that follow during this phase are often the ones that feel like a dance around vulnerability. Avoidants may bring up memories, discuss neutral topics, or lightly test emotional boundaries without diving fully into intimacy. They are probing, feeling out whether the connection can exist without triggering old fears. And it is in your response to this that everything can change. If you respond with calm reassurance, measured emotion, and consistent boundaries, it demonstrates that the connection is indeed safe. If you respond with panic, pressure, or neediness, it reinforces every fear that made them pull away in the first place. Avoidants are watching more than they are speaking. They are analyzing, testing, and imagining what it would be like to feel close again without being overwhelmed. And every small success in this emotional negotiation builds trust, one tiny step at a time. This is why those who attempt to force reconnection often fail, while those who approach with patience, independence, and emotional stability create the conditions for genuine return. The key is consistency, calmness, and the quiet demonstration that love does not need to feel like danger. Finally, the truth about avoidance in love is profound, but often misunderstood. They do not lack feeling, nor do they fail to care. What they lack is the sense of safety that allows them to express that care without fear. They are not rejecting the connection, they are protecting themselves from emotional overwhelm. When they pull away, it is not a measure of your worth, but a reflection of their internal struggles and past experiences. And when they watch, test, and finally allow themselves to return, it is only because they perceive a shift, a proof that the connection can now exist without repeating old patterns. They want reassurance, but not through words or pressure. They want it through calmness, consistency, and independence. When these subtle signals align, the avoidant heart begins to soften. They begin to imagine that love can feel safe, that closeness does not mean danger, that connection does not have to feel suffocating. And in that moment, when patience and emotional maturity meet their guarded heart, what was once silence can slowly transform into a meaningful, cautious, and profoundly sincere return. The journey is slow, delicate, and often frustrating, but it is deeply rooted in the truth that avoidants can love powerfully. They just need the environment to feel safe enough to allow it.